Byzantine chivalry is chivalry in the Byzantine Empire, covering a period from about the 10th through 12th century. In contrast to the better-known chivalry of the Western medieval European feudal system, Byzantine chivalry was the fusion of its Roman and Christian heritage, which was based on martial service, although it also included public charity and protecting the peace of the church, even at personal cost when necessary, in the cause of the empire and the Eastern Orthodox Church. The knights, or more precisely, the elite Byzantine soldiers called akriti, abided by a code with virtues like courage, loyalty, and honor, of course, but also a deep focus on Christianity and a sense of duty to the state. The idea of chivalry in a Byzantine context wasn't codified as it was in the West, but it did influence the behavior and reputation of the Byzantine nobility and military, built around the values of loyalty to God, protection of the weak, and the defense of the empire. But before I get into the Byzantine of it all, make sure you watch this video all the way through. It will be a time travel story uncovering secrets of an age-old warrior code that helped build one of history's most durable empires. And once you are up to speed, post a comment to let me know what you think. Now let's get into it. As the Byzantine Empire developed after the Western Roman Empire had collapsed, the military and political forces were integrated in a way not dissimilar to the former system. On the other side, the influence of the military and the nobility in the Byzantine state was of paramount importance to how the transformation took place. The idea of chivalry, despite how it eventually became codified in the West, developed in a somewhat similar fashion, derived as it was from centuries of heritage of Roman tradition and the rising Christian order that formed in its wake of what was once the Roman Empire of the East, or the Byzantine Empire. The tradition of Byzantine chivalry originated from the military culture which the Byzantines adopted from Rome. The close combat warfare of the Roman legions was lost on the Byzantine battlefields, and Byzantine armies were trained in formal battle formations such as the phalanx. As a result, their battle tactics never managed to reach the level of sophistication of those employed by the legions. But the Roman Empire approaches to war were not shared by the more pragmatic and often merciless Byzantine Empire, whose view of warfare incorporated the Christian values of mercy, humility, and godliness. This was especially important with the Byzantine Empire's primary role in protecting Christendom, the faithful, and the sacred legacy of the empire. And although there was never a clearly defined code of chivalry like in Western Europe, the akriti became an important element in the Byzantine military. The akriti were border soldiers whose role was to defend the empire's borders, including against invaders such as the Arabs and Bulgars, the latter of whom even established an independent state. Participating in the defense of Melitene against the Seljuks, the akriti would be awarded with new lands in the region. These warriors were not only fighters, however, but protectors of Christian society, embodying courage, sacrifice, and loyalty to God and the emperor. They were comparable to Western European knights, but with a more pronounced focus on the protection of both the Christian religion and the state. The Byzantine elite troops frequently fought under generals of aristocratic standing, who often enjoyed high economic and social distinction and were related to the ruling dynasty. This order of warrior nobility incorporated the Christian virtues of humility and service, but it also focused on martial skill and leadership. Those titles under which they served, such as strategos, general, or domestikos, not only answered to their military significance as such, but to them as symbols of power and grace of the Byzantine Empire. Another important basis of the Byzantine system of chivalry was the union of the martial state with the religious. Byzantine warriors were required to be pious and devout followers of Christianity. This involved going to church, fasting, and sometimes even swearing a vow of celibacy or chastity. They were regarded as holy soldiers who waged war not just for the empire, but for the salvation of their souls and the defense of Christendom. Military triumphs under the Byzantine Empire were frequently perceived as expressions of divine favor, with both emperors and generals frequently asserting that the victory of the battlefield was attributed to the service of God. Such divine character of military conflict also had the practical implication that the soldiers engaged in battle for the empire were not in it mainly for personal gain, nor for personal fame, but it was felt that they instead represented, and indeed physically embodied, the defending, staking soul of the empire and of Christendom. They were God's chosen hands on earth, which infused their fighting with religious meaning. Byzantine chivalry included Kydia to the emperor. God's anointed as both a political and spiritual leader, the emperor was considered God's representative on earth. Imperatore erga obedientiam firmior, quiet rebellionem habere non regni solum, sed et regelarum celestis majestatis credita est, Luther. The loyalty of the subject was now supposed to create an obligation stronger, even than that of the law, and disloyalty, obedience, and rebellion, marene seratis deseruisse iovem. Loyal and obedient, then, is the service, for it is the service which properly belongs to the emperor. Governed by his principles of service, the emperor's obedientiam, que circa principem est prescribere, creditor, Ifrita, 297. The notion of disobedience, as of itself a reason for the commination of refuse, is foreign to the Germanic order. Obedience is to be also given the order in accordance to the laws of everything. Whatever the emperor said was the rule, and his rule was important for the health and prosperity of the empire. Consequently, Byzantine soldiers and members of nobility were to display absolute submission to the emperor, even to the point of sacrificing their lives for the empire. The Byzantine Empire was a wealthy and powerful state, constantly threatened by enemies from inside and outside its borders. The empire had a powerful military that it used to fight back invaders, suppress revolts, and keep order among its many lands. In such a setting, the traditional values and virtues of chivalry, bravery, fidelity, and honor would have been severely tested, and the nobles and soldiers of the empire would have had to have found ways of coping with new challenges in practical ways. For the moulding of Byzantine chivalric tradition, the emperor had a strong hand. The emperor was himself the head of the military, but also the moral leader of chivalry and ethics. The electronic statuary that were part of the political armory of HRR Imperawe Re used to force citizens of the HRE to show loyalty to the emperor in his ideal role of a Christian warrior, brave, wise, just, and merciful. He was the standard by which all nobles and soldiers aspired to, and if his acts on and off the battlefield did not reflect the divine order of the empire, justice and fair play were demanded by the nobility of the time, not just old-fashioned lust for blood. There was the idea of honor not only on the battlefield, but also in life. Byzantine soldiers were also to show mercy to prisoners of war. Cruelty was unchristian. The Acritae Code, a code of laws for the military, stressed the extreme care of the non-combatants and the disciplinary treatment of prisoners. This was a reflection of the Christian values that were the essence of Byzantine chivalry. The status of women in the Byzantine chivalric culture was also that women had to be protected and held a position of honor, especially those who were in need of protection. Byzantine women were not warriors, yet they played a significant role in society and were sometimes the object of chivalric actions. Protecting the weak, especially women and children, was also fundamental in the Byzantine soldiers' moral code. Inasmuch as there were military and religious foundations of Byzantine chivalry, it also influenced the general Byzantine society. The nobles and other privileged families who held land, and thus power, were held to moral and ethical standards as high as peasants and other commoners, proving not only military might, but also love of justice and mercy. The etiquette of the emperor was not merely constitutional. To the eyes of his subjects, he was the mirror through which God reflected his justice. His example gave the keynote of the public morals. The idea of Palaiologan chivalry is further linked to the rhetoric the last Byzantine founded state founded by the Palaiologos dynasty. The Palaiologos dynasty, which ruled the empire from 1261 to 1453, considered themselves to be champions of the Christian faith and heirs to the Roman imperial tradition. They encouraged an ethos of Christian chivalry that combined Roman martial virtues with an Eastern Christian sense of religious devotion. Although less structured than the Western European model of chivalry, this system defined the identity of the Byzantine Empire. The chivalric code was not only adhered to by knights, but the societies in which they lived, as well, forming a society which placed much emphasis on honor, duty, and service to God. In a world where the empire was constantly besieged by enemies on the outside and roiled by civil conflict on the inside, the code of chivalry helped to solidify the Byzantine Empire and keep it ascendant for more than 1,000 years. Chivalry and the Byzantine Empire. The 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire shares its own unique relationship with chivalry. As we delve further into the military and social organization of this era, it is important to recognize that Byzantine chivalry wasn't just a code of warriors' behavior, but a fundamental aspect of a society in which religion, politics, and military strategy was a part of one cohesive whole. The idea of Byzantine chivalry was also connected to an imperial attitude to diplomacy. The court life of Byzantium was not unlike that of any other medieval realm. It was renowned for its political and diplomatic maneuvering and its lavish banquets, but also for its ceremonial and processions. Courtly behavior, it must be added, was an essential component of Byzantine chivalry, though it was not always expressed in a martial aspect. In such circumstances, what is more, the elites, military and diplomatic men who had risen by their service to the emperor, also acted out of honor and moral duty. This was often, however, more subtle than the straightforward martial behavior of the men. One is struck by the divergence of the part that chivalric values played in the Byzantine East and in the Latin West. For all that Western knights were often extolled in epic literature, in the stories of King Arthur or the Crusaders, for example, the Byzantine concept of military honor was soberer, more practical, and based on the demands of state and faith. The East's chivalry under the Byzantine system, after all, was one of discipline and strategy. The Roman heritage in the East demonstrated that military stability and administrative necessity are what counted. So virtue, therefore, wasn't married to the pageantry characteristic of the West, but rather was the very lodestar for effective rule and the maintenance of imperial supremacy. Though less mythologized than its Western sibling, the knightly ideal was an important narrative for the Byzantine Empire all the same. Cavalry, or akritae, were defenders of both the empire and its faith, but this was all very practical. These were frontier soldiers whom the empire would occasionally call upon to defend it from foreign incursions, whether Arab or later Seljuk. Their courage was a key factor in the defense of the Byzantine realm. Their heroism could not be disassociated from their faith and from their loyalty to the emperor. One of the interesting things about Byzantine chivalric culture is how it was a reaction to the needs of the empire. This need was exacerbated by the shrinking of the empire under invasions and civil strife. This is increasingly the case under the Komnenoi in the 11th and 12th centuries. It was during this period that the Byzantine Emperor Alexios III Komnenos attempted to re-establish the Byzantine forces to what it had been. The loyalty to the emperor also took on increasing importance during this time, as the Komnenos dynasty was less like to have military successes if these loyal servants did not help facilitate them. The generals of the time were not even just generals. They were also the protectors of Christian orthodoxy, and this responsibility was deeply felt by both leaders. The commander's title wasn't just a rank, it was a physical representation of a warrior's responsibility to defend the empire against outside attacks, but it also represented their spiritual duty to protect the faith. These men were essential because the emperor, as the supreme Christian ruler, depended upon them to keep the empire safe and Christian. In the Byzantine Empire, chivalry was uncoupled from the racy ethical imbroglio of the West. It could happen, Shakespeare's as but spread, to a comparable ideal of virtue on the battlefield. It affected the rulers' relations with their subjects and the emperor's relations with the nobility and common people. And the emperor was considered not only the supreme guardian of the state, but also of its religious and moral purity. Naturally, therefore, it was the emperor's responsibility to keep order and peace, and to make sure that there was equal justice and mercy in the realm. The emperor's contribution was not infrequently thought of as the embodiment of God's will, and the possibility of his functioning as the head of both army and church was instrumental in conserving both the ideal image of Byzantium and, to some extent, of protecting it from vulgar reality. It should also be noted that Byzantine chivalry was tightly linked to the defense of the Eastern Orthodox faith. Just as Byzantine soldiers were expected to demonstrate virtues such as courage, honor, and loyalty, so also they were compelled to take an oath to defend the church, its clergy, and its sacred places. Part of the empire's military functional was to protect important religious sites such as the Holy City of Jerusalem and keep peace in areas deemed sacred. The fact that the military and religious responsibilities were superimposed gave rise to a specific kind of chivalric virtue, which was not present in Western Europe, where the church had often been more independent of military action. Knighthood was also found in the dedication to God demonstrated by Byzantine chivalry. Knights were not just warriors, they were also supposed to uphold Christian values as moral exemplars. This moral and religious aspect lent Byzantine warriors a sacred duty. Their function on the battlefield was not simply the acquisition or the defense of territory, but the preservation of the Christian order. This turned Byzantine chivalry into something far more than a secular military code. It was faith and a sacred service to God and the man who wore the crown that was anointed by his hand. Such values were ingrained in the system of military training which had evolved in Byzantium, where aristocratic and non-aristocratic soldiers alike were educated in courage, especially honor, and duty to God. It was this concern for the protection of the weak that made Byzantine chivalry so interesting. This principle was not confined to the battlefield, but governed Byzantium across the board. The Acritai had the duty of defending the frontier villages, but along with this they had to protect the infirmed members of society, such as the poor, women, and children. This was kind of aligned with Christian morality, which was pervasive. Within the context of Byzantine culture, soldiers who turned ferocious against civilians were condemned by the Byzantines, and such behavior was a matter for disgrace, not personal gain. The noble warrior's mission, in contrast, was to defend those too weak or unable to defend themselves, an ideal consistent with Christian concepts of charity, mercy, and humility. In Byzantine knighthood, the notion of mercy was equally important. The slighting of defeated enemies or the pity and honor found to be due in them can be seen as a mark of a true knight. Whereas in the West you have the stereotype of knights being great because they could kill and subdue their Enemies. In Byzantium, the ideal was more about keeping yourself in check. A graduated policy of clemency was also pursued by Byzantine leaders towards their prisoners. For instance, when they were not executed outright, they could sometimes redeem payment or even become part of the Byzantine order. This mode of mercy was not only perceived to be a virtue of personal concert, but also an expression of Christian humility and compassion. The arts and culture were also crucial to the chivalric system of the Byzantinian. Tales of chivalry and knighthood were commonly eroticized with themes of Byzantine literature and were absorbed in the Paleologan period. Emperor and his generals often became the heroes in arts and literature, and their great virtues and valor would live on for centuries in the cultural narratives. The notion was convenient in the formation of the Byzantine nobility, since there was little in common between the later Byzantine aristocrat and the silver tetrarchs, who might be taken as models. Decline and fall of the Byzantine Empire. As the empire declined and fell to foreign invasion and internal discord, the chivalric trappings of Byzantium continued in peculiar forms. Its precepts shaped the behavior of the warriors of the succeeding ages, and in some countries these, especially after the decay of Byzantine culture, such as the lands where Russo-Greek civilization was supreme, lingered later than elsewhere. Love and loyalty to the faith and protection of the weak, joined to the sense of noble service, first to the emperor and then to the church, these things took root in the military system and traditions of the Slavic and Orthodox Christian states, which superseded the Byzantine Empire. As we delve further into the complicated and nuanced universe of chivalry in the Byzantine Empire, it's important to bear in mind the broader social and cultural matrix that framed and implemented these ideologies. The Byzantine Empire was a melting pot of different cultures, traditions and creeds which influenced army morale, honor and reputation. This mixture of Roman military values and Christian morality formed the foundation of a distinct chivalric culture, unlike the knightly culture in Western Europe. Among the Byzantines, the distinction between noble and common soldier was less pronounced than it was to become in Western Europe. Although there was indeed a class of chivalric knights who were compelled to respect the virtues of honor, loyalty, and piety, there was also significant meritocratic and individualistic sentiment. Byzantine warrior service was not limited to those who grew up in noble families. Even low-born men who had demonstrated great skill and bravery could get to high ranks in the military and ultimately titles or land. The system was based on merit, reflecting the Roman emphasis of rewarding achievement in action rather than noble lineage. This pragmatic ideal of military service, in which ruling rank in the military could be achieved on grounds other than bloodline, was also a feature of Byzantine chivalry. It made it so that the concepts of honor and loyalty were accessible to any man, whether he be the most insignificant soldier or most influential noble. It fostered a common sense of identity and purpose, as soldiers, no matter how low or high their birth position, were all expected to give their lives equally to the empire and its ideals. Byzantine chivalry affected as well the empire's war conduct. The Byzantines were masters of complex war-making and capable of adjusting to new military conditions, but they were also very influenced by the idea of holy waging. The Byzantines were not fighting wars merely to add to their territory or to obtain some political advantage. They fought wars as a religious duty. The concept of just war was firmly ingrained in Byzantine military thinking and was linked to the larger Christian view of the world that ordered the empire's politics and society. The idea of a just war rested on the idea that the emperor, who was God's representative on earth, was divinely entitled to wage war to defend faith, empire, and subjects. The Byzantine war machine, in other words, considered it was not only an instrument of conquest but also the guardian of peace, order, and the Christian faith. And this was what differentiated the Byzantine way of war from the brutal, expansionist campaigns of other empires. The Byzantines were not conquerors as other empires, but defenders of a sacred order. An important part of Byzantine chivalry was the emperor's position as the leader of military, political, and moral, i.e., religious, leaders. The emperor was the highest political authority in the divine and shaped more around the ideals of chivalry than around the class of chivalry. Being the head of the church and the military, it was thought that what the emperor does is what God approves of. Such a divine commission would place a burden on the emperor, not only for the political stability of the empire, but also for the salvific standing of its subjects. So the emperor's behavior in both war and in peace was regarded as an outward sign of the power and godliness of the empire. In Byzantine chivalry, the emperor's participation in warfare loomed large. Unlike in Western Europe, where kings and other nobles frequently fought in the front lines themselves, only a few Byzantine emperors treated the flower of their nobles which same way. Instead, they left it to their generals and military commanders to fight campaigns while remaining closely involved in planning and directing military strategy. Such a system enabled the emperor to concentrate his efforts on guarding the homelands and Christianity and leave the actual combat to the experienced war leaders. Most famously, it worked was during the reign of Emperor Alexios the Komnenos in 1081-1118 metal, tin, bronze year, 1081-1118 Andronicus. I was forced to annex military power to the throne, and Alexios not having any such power until he became an old man, his reign was under attack. But Alexios was also much engaged in the strategy of Byzantine military policy. He knew that it was not sufficient for the empire to stay strong in warriors without enjoying the spiritual and ethical advice of the emperor. This model of the emperor as warrior and moral exemplar further established the link between chivalric program and political leadership of the empire. Loyalitas. Another key quality in Byzantine chivalric culture was loyalty, vital in and out of combat. They believed it was loyalty to the emperor, loyalty to their fellow soldiers, and loyalty to the empire which defined their lives. Loyalty, though, was not something that flowed in one direction. The emperor, as head of the military and state, was also responsible for expressing civic loyalty to the people, especially the armies who defended the state. This reciprocal bond of loyalty between the emperor and his warriors worked also in the opposite direction, encouraging trust and respect between monarch and subjects, integral to the functioning of the Byzantine society. The idea of a two-way loyalty was further strengthened by the rewards and honors offered to soldiers who show exceptional bravery, loyalty, and devotion to the empire. Soldiers in the Byzantine army would often receive land, titles, or other privileges in return for their service. These were rewards that were not just material, but also representations of the soldier's position within the broader societal and political order of the empire. The military aristocracy of the Byzantines, as of the West, tried to earn honor and reward in battle, as much as by the extent of their loyalty to the emperor and to Christianity. The relationship between chivalric ideals and Christianity is also an obvious factor in Byzantine chivalry. In the Byzantine system of thought, a life of military service was not a question of self-seeking or self-glory. It was, rather, a sacred obligation that was inextricably linked to the individual's relationship with God. This divine determination also imbued the Byzantine army with a higher purpose than the simple mechanics of warfare. For soldiers of Byzantium, winning a combat was not just the defeat of an enemy, but also the actualization of a divine imperative to defend the faith and empire. The Byzantine elite, as well as having a role in the military as its leaders, had to maintain strict personal probity. The values of meekness, modesty, and modesty were accepted as a fact of life in medieval Byzantine society. The highly Christianized Byzantine Empire, with its fusion of Christian last evil and Platonic anti-materialism, was increasingly concerned with the personal morality of each individual in all aspects of their life. For his Byzantine warrior, the chivalric virtues were not simply abstract ideas, but practical precepts of how to live a life that was right and honorable. One of the most interesting things about Byzantine chivalric was how it seeped into the empire's diplomatic composition. The Byzantine Empire's epicenter was so highly interconnected by trade and alliance that it was among the masters of diplomacy. Byzantine diplomats gained a high reputation for skill in negotiating and were often used to settle disputes between other nations. This diplomatic art was closely related to chivalric values of honor and loyalty, given that when acting on behalf of the empire, Byzantine diplomats were to represent the honor of the empire, but at the same time should also ensure their diplomatic counterparts reciprocally represented the interests of their foreign powers. Byzantine diplomacy, as much as the military and social structure, was based on chivalry ideals. Diplomats were supposed to be tactful, diplomatic, and honorable toward other countries. This meant that they were supposed to be loyal to the emperor, the empire, and, in the case of treaties and agreements, ensure that they were favorable to Byzantium. This model of diplomacy allowed the Byzantine Empire to retain its primacy as a major player in the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries, withstanding both external enemies and deep internal divisions. Throughout the empire's decline in the 13th century, Byzantine chivalry continued to flourish in the spirit of those fighting to save the empire from external forces. As the empire became increasingly lessened politically and militarily, however, the 7 values of loyalty, honor, and faith continued to inform the conduct of Byzantine soldiers and nobles. The tradition of the Byzantine knight persisted in the cultural and military ethos of the sub-states that formed after the fall of the empire as well. As we can begin to explore the legacy of Byzantine chivalry, however, we should also consider how the fall of the Byzantine Empire affected the continued existence and development of its martial and cultural values. In 1453, the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire was finally ended, and yet despite the collapse of the Byzantine Empire at the hands of both outside invaders and feuding insiders, and a decline in military capability, the honor code of chivalry that was sewn into the fabric of Byzantine society did not disappear. Instead, they continued in various guises in the societies and cultures of the post-empire. The Byzantine political and military system based on chivalric values, honor, loyalty, valor, and above all Christianity, have disappeared in hierarchical terms. When the Eastern Empire fell and Jews and Muslims flocked to Ottoman despotism, loyalty, honor, and defense of Christianity remained in Eastern Orthodox Christian societies. These values that had been so ingrained into the DNA of Byzantine identity and into the cultures that outlived Byzantium in the Balkans, southwestern Europe, and, to a degree, in the Eastern Mediterranean. This ideal of defending Christianity against enemies, preserving the weak, and also preserving personal honor was adopted and transformed into other Islamic successor states as well. After the capture of Constantinople, many states in the Balkans and the Eastern Europe, such as the Kingdom of Serbia, the Principality of Moldavia, and the Kingdom of Poland, were culturally influenced by the loosened spirit of the Byzantine culture, which had a widespread impact. At first, these states experienced a period of military recovery and chivalric ethos, mixing it with own local traditions. For instance, the Serbian nobility continued to give credence to the Byzantine conception of military commander and Later Christian knight, whilst in Poland, the notion of the chivalric knight took on a different meaning, evolving to being a conception of chivalry as defending the faithful. The sting of this definition for the Polish knight was the idea of standing separated from harsh use of the weapon when fighting against Ottoman Empire forces. After all, some part of a Byzantine chivalric culture had survived and influenced the newly instituted military and noble elites. In a number of these successor states, the Byzantine impact upon chivalry was more than active in terms of warfare, but also on culture and social life. The Byzantine insistence on loyalty to the emperor was reconciled with the changed political situation. In these successor states, without a simple dynasty, an emperor had lost his meaning in the Byzantine definition of one who stands as an absolute monarch with a divine mandate similar to that of the old Roman Republican Senate, and the new monarchies opposed such a position. Whether the King of Poland or the Moldavian voivode, these rulers were frequently conceived of as the God-protected defenders of their people and faith, just as the Byzantine emperor had been. Byzantine concepts of chivalry can also be found in the Christian Orthodox states of Bulgaria, Serbia, and Russia. The Byzantine emperors were, of course, at the center of the Orthodox Christian universe, and church and state in Byzantine society were so thoroughly intertwined that the church's spiritual authority was never isolated from and was frequently spattered by the grubbiness of state business. Following the fall of the empire, the Orthodox Church had remained a unifying influence for these successor states, and the chivalric code that was an element of Byzantine martial culture was also incorporated into the leadership of the clergy. Monasteries and religious orders were frequently assigned the duty to defend holy places and Christian strongholds, inspired by the Byzantine concept that military valor was never far separated from religious fervor. The legacy of Byzantine chivalry also influenced the Ottomans themselves, the men who had destroyed the Byzantine Empire. Ottoman society, especially in its earlier years, had been shaped by the Byzantine heritage of military organization and administrative apparatus. The Ottomans knew much about Byzantine military success and structure of administration, allowing their empire to incorporate Byzantine culture and institutions into their own state-building practices. One notable example of this influence is the Janissaries, the elite corps of the Ottoman Empire. Mind you, the Janissaries were a unique institution, but they, sure being a military, did borrow from Byzantine military tradition. Additionally, the Janissaries, much like the Byzantines before them, were elite and therefore held to a high standard of behavior with very high criteria of loyalty, honor, and religious fervor. Byzantine chivalric values that affected the Janissaries include loyalty to the Sultan, strong Islamic piety, and military skill as far as cultural borrowings are concerned. The most interesting legacy of Byzantine militarism is the idea of Christian warriorhood. Although the Byzantine Empire had ceased to be a political power, the tradition of self-identification with the Romans, insisting to be called Romaic, has survived in the far less political influence of the Orthodox inhabitants of the former Roman Empire. The concept of the warrior monk who combined fighting with monastic discipline continued in the Eastern Orthodox world. The notion of mixing faith with military service endured in the form of monasteries, military orders, and the approach Orthodox clergy took to the defense of Christian lands. One of the most lasting examples of the Byzantine image of chivalry was the Palaiologos dynasty, the ruling family of the last dynasty of the Byzantine Empire. Although the Palaiologan emperors could not reverse the course of decline that had set their empire in the 7th and 8th centuries, they provided the necessary stimulus for the resurgence of Roman culture and the beginnings of the Renaissance of Greek learning. The emperors of the Palaiologos dynasty were renowned for their piety, their spiritual devotion to the Christian faith, and their support of the legacy of the Byzantine Empire. After the capture of Constantinople, members of the Palaiologos family found refuge and brought with them to Italy the Italian Renaissance literature, consisting of the teachings of the humanists and the intellectuals who communicated the culture of Byzantine chivalrous values. In the centuries that intervened between the fall of the empire and Renaissance, Byzantine chivalry would influence the work of writers, artists, and philosophers. The excellence of the noble knight, such an essential feature among the Byzantine military and society, was the subject of imitation in the literature of the time. Byzantine models were the precursors of chivalry in antebellum Florence, where the use of the term before the 16th century follows mining excavations. Byzantine influences were also expressed in Renaissance art through Christian-oriented themes such as single figures of saints and warriors who took care of their spirit and would do every activity count them least personal amount. One of the most potent ways in which Byzantine chivalric ideals found survival after the fall of the empire was in the oral and written traditions of those who once constituted its body. A great deal of the values, tales, and traditions of Byzantine chivalry were preserved for centuries in the folklore of Balkans and Eastern Europe. These tales, often involving heroic soldiers of the faith and of the empire, maintained the flame of Byzantine chivalry even after the empire was no longer there. In the modern period, the tradition of Byzantine chivalry has left its mark in the Orthodox Christian world, especially in the cultural and spiritual life of the Balkans. The values of honor, loyalty, and piety for which the warrior Byzantine was noted continue to have echoes in the cultural identity of the region. For better or for worse, whether from literary or from institutionally military traditions, the chivalric ethic of the Byzantine state, like chivalry to the discourse of medieval Western Christianity, is but a critical constituent of the shared heritage of the Orthodox Christian world. As a continuation of my last post, we need to appreciate the significance of Byzantine chivalry in the evolution of military leadership during the post-fall centuries. The Byzantine model of rule, even after the empire's demise, was influential on the political culture of its successor states in the non-Western, where the tradition of Orthodox Christianity maintained, albeit under the French and Crusader states, of the Middle Ages. As we explore this transition, we can see that Byzantine chivalry lived on the machismo of the general and the grunt on the ground. One field where the influence of the Byzantine Empire can be observed after the empire itself was no more is in the broader military strategies of the successor states in Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. Although the military of the Byzantines had been characterized by the use of combined arms, strategic planning, and flexible tactics, these played their part in continuing the military thought in areas which in some cases had once been in the Byzantine world. The Byzantine army was one that was used to defend rather than to expand, and that latter doctrine would be imprinted on future military thinking in the region. In the Kingdom of Serbia, in particular, military leaders followed many Byzantine practices, including employing heavily armed cavalry, social structure, siege tactics, and reliance on leading defensive positions. The notion of guarding Christendom from the outside enemy remained a pillar of the Serbian military strategy, even when the Ottoman Turks started to conquer the country. Just like their Byzantine predecessors, Serbian knights and military commanders were often portrayed as virtuous protectors of the faith, their conquests set in the light of sacred expeditions and not rugged territorial expansion. The link between Byzantine chivalric ideals and contemporary military command can also be observed in the Principality of Moldova. Moldavian leaders of the 14th and 15th century again underscored their identification with the Christian religion and at the same time with the Slavic peoples who are considered a bulwark against the Muslims Ottomans. They wanted to be like the Byzantine emperor, who was both a military and spiritual leader, an occupant of the throne who enjoyed power not only of war, but to defend religious beliefs. Moldavian rulers also honored these chivalric virtues held by the Byzantines, and they, like the Byzantines before them, portrayed chivalry, faith in religion, and protecting the poor as a chivalric way of life as well. Though these successor states continued to incorporate many elements of the Byzantine military, they also developed a tradition that was all their own, drawing from local customs while maintaining some of the Byzantine virtues they had inherited. This synthesis produced battle cultures that were at once aventuri and deeply grounded in the chivalric ethos created by the Byzantine Republic. The principle that warriors could ascend the ranks through merit rather than birth continued to play a distinguished role, as it had in the Byzantine Empire as well. It meant that soldiers of all backgrounds could rise to prominence, power, and glory based on their bravery, loyalty, and service to the common good. Even after the transfer of political power with the fall of Byzantium, the ideal of honor was to remain extremely influential as a premise within military and social life. The concept that reputation was important to personal identity, especially as a warrior or noble, was a pervasive element of Byzantine thinking. The same can be said of the military culture of Eastern Europe, where honor was seen as critical to the individual's success as much as its collective. Even in the Ottoman Empire itself, as noted above, Byzantine chivalric ideals were not without influence, especially when it came to how the Ottomans structured their elite soldiers. The Janissaries, who dominated during the 15th and 16th centuries, were largely a product of Byzantine military tradition. The Janissaries' loyalty to the Sultan was similar to the zeal which motivated the Byzantine warriors' loyalty to the emperor, while their system of education and discipline was based on a code of honor and duty similar, if not almost identical, to the chivalric code held by the Byzantines. The Ottoman military, just as the Byzantine one before it, highly valued loyalty, courage, and devotion to a greater cause, be it the defense of Islam or, in those earlier years, the empire's Christian legacy. However, we should also take into consideration the cultural and religious tourists within the Eastern Orthodox Church, and thus take into consideration the legacy of the Byzantine chivalric culture. The church and the warrior class was crucial in Byzantine life. And after the empire fell, it helped define the way the Eastern Orthodox world worshipped. Religious leaders were regularly moral and spiritual advisors for the military elite, providing direction for the most effective way to deal with the challenges of war, loyalty of one's country, and honor. Many Roman, Byzantine, Eastern Orthodox rulers and military officers largely considered themselves Christian crusaders on political and spiritual crusade. The overlapping of military and religious functions led to an ethos in which militarism and the warrior vocation were considered a divine vocation. This concept of the Christian soldier, a member of an army who not only served for personal gain, but rather to protect the faith and the empire, was a cornerstone of Byzantine military thought, and would continue to be important in the post-Byzantine period. Christian leaders in the Balkans and Eastern Europe famously claimed, too, that their struggles were a holy war, part of God's larger battle to protect Christendom, even as it was repeatedly buffeted by Ottoman advances. The inheritance of Byzantine chivalric concepts and language affected how the regional demies were structurally and politically mobilized early in the wars. The rulers of that region played up the necessity to defend not just their territories, but their faith. They played on the Byzantine ethos of martial virtue laced with religious zeal. They were frequently not professional armies, but gradually organized warriors who rallied for religious reasons. Although their military methods were based on those of Byzantium, the volunteers also demonstrated a great deal of regional pride and wished to keep the identity of Eastern Orthodox culture and faith intact. Also worthy of consideration is women's participation in the promulgation of Byzantine chivalric values. In the women of the Byzantine Empire, there was no active heroine, but her influence was deeply felt both in the moral and the spiritual life of that society which she molded. They were supposed to be moral role models for husbands and sons, and to inspire them to honor, loyalty, and piety. During this period, they were dominant in the court, being advisors and patrons of the arts, ensuring that the cultural and moral values of Byzantine chivalric society were demonstrated. The status of women in the succeeding states of the fallen empire. In such an atmosphere, women in the successor states assumed the responsibilities of sustaining the form of the moral unity. They were considered as the protectors of their family's honor and the preservers of the Byzantine traditions, which were thought as handed down directly from the Roman era. In Eastern Orthodox communities as well, many of the women of noble families played a key role in the social network that made the church the main authority, coordinating and funding events to feed the poor, as well as perform other good deeds which were in essence an extension of the role of their knightly duty to protect the weak and uphold Christian ideals. The legacy of Byzantine chivalric ethos, for its part, left an influence on the post-Byzantine militaristic culture and religious behavior. The enduring afterlife of these ancient models suggests that they offered more than just an ornament to the political culture of the Byzantine state, even when the political institution of Byzantium lay in ruins. In an age of external aggression and internal conflict, the values of honor, loyalty, and the faith witnessed the potential of being preserved as principles of leadership and martial discipline. The long-term impact of chivalry in Byzantium extended beyond successor states. In the centuries since the empire's fall, the virtues and lessons of Byzantine warrior culture percolated through Western European military traditions as nations and modern military institutions began to take shape. Not only people with such connections to the Byzantine world, but even other peoples thought of the latter as an example of martial endeavor and disciplined leadership. While we continue with our theme of points, culture, and ideas for Byzantine chivalry, I think we should look at the cultural transmission and intellectual legacy of the Byzantine Empire as related to military and social conduct. While the empire itself ceased to exist in 1453, the philosophical and cultural tenements that had influenced the Byzantine military experience were propagated throughout the Mediterranean world. These principles would be later taken up by the prospective state-builders of Eastern Europe and the Ottoman Empire, but also entered the collective consciousness of Western European polities, mainly by means of the flow of scholars, monks, and soldiers who directly observed what the final days of the Byzantine Empire looked like. After the fall of Constantinople, one of the major mediums through which chivalric ideal continued to survive and retain its influence was the transfer of the educated class from east of the Mediterranean to the west. Knowledge of the bureaucratic systems, the military and cultural strategies of Byzantine took many scholars, priests, and nobles who fled the Ottoman conquest. These thinkers were frequently wholeheartedly embraced in Italy and elsewhere in Western Europe, and played an important role in the early Renaissance. One field that saw a marked effect from the Byzantine influence was military tactician and curtain design. Byzantine military books like the Satyricon of Emperor Maurice and the Tactica of 10th century General Leo VI had a deep impact on the European psyche. A characteristic of Byzantine military literature was that it tended to be highly technical and therefore a rhetoric-free application of actual knowledge on behalf of military manuals that included information on tactics in the battlefield. Siegecraft and the organization of an army became among the main military sources for medieval forces throughout Europe. The Byzantine concept of combined arms with the combined use of cavalry, infantry, and archers was admired by military thinkers and adopted into Western theory. Furthermore, Byzantine tactics have also played a notable role in the development of Renaissance warfare, primarily in the form of the assiduous military treatises of the intellectuals who were educated under the remnants of Byzantine culture. The most famous case of this influence is that of the Italian philosopher and military strategist Niccolò Machiavelli. With the use of anecdotes, he explains the effectiveness of Prince himself. Although Machiavelli devoted himself to political and military matters, the influence of Byzantine thought, and more particularly the Byzantines' taste for discipline, strategy, and military organization, is visible throughout his works. It is this model of the Byzantine army's flexibility in different situations, particularly in the time of crises, that attracted Machiavelli, who developed his own theory of the need for flexible leadership in sync with his readings of Byzantine history. But aside from military strategy, even diplomatic practices of the Byzantines similarly influenced Renaissance politics and statecraft. Byzantine diplomats played behind-the-scenes games well, utilizing marriage alliances, bribery, and subterfuge to further the empire's interests. Byzantine diplomats were noted for their skills in operating in the sphere of complex political situations. These ways of the weak became fashionable and were instilled in Renaissance princes and served as a template during the early modern period in Italy. The Byzantine respect for the use of diplomacy as a tool of power, where the reconquest of the other could complement formal military victory, created an advocacy for the post-classical combination of military and political strength amongst the medieval Italian states, which continued as a custom into the 16th century. But the inheritance of Byzantine chivalric concepts did not end with military and political philosophy. Even after the capture of Constantinople, the ideals of honor, loyalty, and Christian care for the welfare of the less fortunate, especially those one served alongside, led to further behavior that exemplified virtues of nobility that had long characterized the Orthodox and Western Christian nobility. The concept of the warrior knight with the martial skill and moral character for true chivalry was a popular archetype in East and West. In the Byzantine era, these were part and parcel of sacerdotalism, and it was the question only of obtaining the military blessing of both God and the empire. These chivalric values continued to have an effect on Orthodox Christian society even after the fall of Byzantium. In places like Greece, Serbia, and Russia, the idea of the noble warrior, of someone who fought not out of self-interest, but to protect the faith, remained a powerful force. The belief that military service was a sacred duty continued, and military leaders in these areas viewed themselves as protectors of Christian civilization, much in the manner of Byzantine predecessors. This image of the Christian soldier would endure through the ages, particularly in moments of foreign threat or religious strife. In the Russian Empire, the influence of Byzantium's ideals of nobility are also apparent in the use of the double-headed eagle as the universal symbol of imperial power. The Russian Tsars, who developed what became known as the Tsarist autocracy, also claimed the right to that part of the world, and to the title Tsar Caesar, and part of what the civilizations of Rome and Byzantium had to offer. The Tsar himself was usually known as Tsar of all the Russias until the reign of Peter the Great. Byzantine standards influenced by the time of the Byzantine defeat by the Ottoman Empire in 1453, the decline of the Byzantine military tradition was evident, and its significance was seen in the role of the Russians in the conquest. Further, the concept of a noble warrior who answered both to God and to the state was already deeply rooted in Russian culture. The 15th century Russian Cossacks, a class of warriors, practiced many of the values of the chivalric code of the Byzantine Empire. They were notorious for their fervent Tsarist patriotism, religious zeal, and aggressive defense of the faith against external enemies. That marriage of the Cossack warrior and the ancient acrite of the Byzantine tradition is a powerful reminder of the lasting impact of Byzantine military culture upon the warrior castes of the Eastern realms. Another testament of their Chivalric influence on the Byzantine Empire is witnessed by the way in which Eastern Orthodox religious orders and fighting monks upheld them. Monasteries, notably in the Balkans, had an essential function to fulfill, not only on a social but religious level, keeping reading, writing, and art alive too in the Pale of Settlement in the face of Ottoman expansion. Monks and clergy were not only concerned with religious life, they also acted as defenders of Christian communities. In some cases, monks even took up arms to fight off invaders from their monasteries and holy sites, a tradition which harked back to Byzantium, where fighting and piety could go hand in hand. We see this most clearly in the defense of Mount Athos in Greece, where monks there were able to hold off Ottoman expansion and thus maintain the sanctity of the monastery and its property. The concept of the fighting monk was not exclusive to the Byzantines, but they certainly had some impact. In Halkiopoulos' essay, a point has sometimes not been noted in this context. The monks and clerics continued to function as coffees and earthly defenders of the faith. Halkiopoulos, 2010 thought, the occultation of religious with militarist duty in the chivalric culture of Byzantium would continue for Christian Orthodox traditions of soldiers well after the empire fell. That such chivalric ideals survived in the Eastern Orthodox countries even after the collapse of the empire speaks to their timeless character as a paradigm. The warrior philosophy, with its basis in Christian piety, piast loyalty, and following defense of the helpless, remained influencing in military and society of Eastern lands for centuries to come. From the Cossacks to the Greek independence fighters of the 19th century, the legacy of Byzantine chivalry was ingrained in those who considered themselves defenders of Christian civilization. Even more surprisingly, the Byzantine model of the knightly warrior as defender and servant of the faith remained a living symbol in Orthodox Christian churches today. The notion of military service as a spiritually elevated obligation and of loyalty to a higher calling is still an enormously potent influence on the way many Orthodox Christians understand their place in the world. The Byzantine heritage, the sense of honor, of faith and courage still resonates among those who feel themselves protectors of Christian values. When examining Byzantine chivalric aspirations, we would do well to consider how the influence of these moral characteristics reached into the broader social and cultural canvas of the Eastern Orthodox world and continued to shape the society, comportment, and conscience of people who inherited the mantle of the imperial eagle. The art, literature, and intellectual life of the empire were restored to such a degree that there was a constant stream of emigration into what were then the lands of the Italian Renaissance. The values of Byzantine chivalry, loyalty, faith, honor, and service were not just characteristic of the military establishment, and were also rooted in everyday life for the civilian populace. Byzantine society was extremely hierarchical, with the people clearly divided into an aristocracy and plebs. The relatively small but powerful aristocracy lived under similar conditions to the Western feudal lords, and it practiced some form of serfdom. Yet the chivalric virtues were within everyone's reach, and the tenor of daily life was permeated, with them to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the specific occupation, the degree of education achieved, and the rules of engagement, whether artistic or religious. In the arts, for instance, immense honor was accorded to the noble virtues that characterized the Byzantine military in religious imagery and literature. Bravery, honor, and piety. The soldier P.E. res adores, super R, and mercery, res, soldiers, and saints alike and MSY, so it's three virtues. Aristocratic, Christian knight, honor, and monk, piety. The autonomy of those were S-Ping, patriotic march of thouso mankind, CEE I 147 173 I 53 173. The chief means by which these values were carried on was teaching of a religious and moral nature, denizens and non-emperors would be influenced by the Byzantine Church was a key element in the empire and have an effect on all those residing in society. Feudal and chivalric values were reinforced with the portrayal of knights who practiced a rough and tumble but honest form of Christianity in their common and daily lives. For the Byzantine aristocracy, and particularly the army, religion was integral to their identity. So not only were military leaders required to be adept at battle, but also to practice restraint, compassion, and mercy, values derived from Christian teachings. For the masses, religious faith and piety were fundamental elements of daily existence, and the Church epitomized the higher moral vocation to which all social orders aspired. As a reference to the cultural and religious heritage of the Byzantine Empire, one need only consider the contribution of Orthodox Christianity to the making of national names in Eastern Europe. The Byzantine Church had been a solid factor for the spiritual and cultural unity of the Orthodox Slavs. Army and religious leaders, as Byzantium fell and moved west, took with them the attitudes of Byzantine chivalry that passed on to the emerging cultures of, for example, Russia, Serbia and Bulgaria, and other Eastern European states. In Russia, it finds expression in the idea of the Third Rome. Russian rulers considered themselves the inheritors of the Byzantine birthright following the fall of Constantinople. The Russian Orthodox Church, having close ties to Byzantine culture, and being the religion of the Russian rulers rather than the land of the Rus, which prior to this had been pagan, became the foundation of a Russian national identity. Justly, as the Byzantine emperors before them, the Russian Tsars viewed themselves as defenders of the faith and the protectors of the Christian world. In most respects, the military elite of Russia clearly adhered to the ideals of Byzantine chivalry, with their knights and warriors considering themselves as conducting a religious war to protect Christianity from Islam and from the heathen of the East. The creation of Serbia and Bulgaria followed a similar pattern of cultural and military reconstruction. For instance, Duke Boda of Ljubljana in Duklja was a Serbian warrior who refused to submit to the authority of the Pope, refused to renounce Eastern Orthodoxy, and utterly rejected attempts to diminish the traditional wartime ethos in Serbia, because he would not be cowed by Pope Leo's army or Basilissa Regent's threats to be trampled by in the same way that his father once was. These dogmas found expression not only in battle tactics, but also in the courtly civilization of the Serbian nobility stratum, which regarded themselves as heirs of the Byzantine Christian knighthood tradition. The idea of the Christian soldier endured throughout Eastern Europe and the Balkans, who continued to revere chivalric values as part of local folklore, literature, and art composition. Saints, knights and martyrs came to stand in relation to contrasting virtue practice of bravery, piety, and self-sacrifice, which were archetypically of chivalric dimensions in Byzantine culture. These legends were transmitted through generations and were a moral inspiration for both the nobility and all other people, and carried the notion that the honor and the faith in which a person held were ideals one should strive to achieve. Furthermore, Byzantine chivalry values were also an important factor in shaping the ethos of the religious and military professional orders of the Orthodox Church. The Church had its own military orders, such as the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar in Western Europe, and these military orders, such as the Knights Hospitaller, defended the Church's territory and upheld order in the Byzantine territories. Such religious warriors, well read even in the canons of Byzantine chivalric ethic, kept the sacred tradition of defending Christianity even when the empire shrunk and the political power of Orthodox Church was gone. This ideal tended to be carried into unworldly life, for instance among the Orthodox monks and the soldier-monk defenders of Mount Athos. Greece's Mount Athos was such a potent symbol of Byzantine piety and of the Byzantine martial spirit. Despite Ottoman efforts to subjugate the region, the monks and indigenous fighters were capable of protect their religious and political autonomy. Service to God, defense of sacred icons, fearless honesty in facing the odds was the measure of this confrontation. The fusion of the Byzantine martial ideal and the tradition of fighting for the faith culminated in the defenders of Mount Athos, who thought of themselves not only as soldiers but guardians of the Christian faith. One of the lasting features of Byzantine chivalry is community responsibility and assistance. The Byzantine idea of the righteous soldier, a warrior who defends the empire only when the empire defends Christian values, who defends the weak and the poor, who condemns racism and evil, was something that still resonated in Eastern Orthodox cultures. The obligation of protecting the feeble, the indigent, the helpless, for whom natural affection could not or would not care, was equally familiar as a military and as a social duty. In war, even Byzantine soldiers were ordered to spare prisoners and civilians, a concept imported to the Orthodox Christian world. Mercy was very important, as it was not only an indication of one's personal virtue, but a demonstration of Christian values. Rundown of the values of mercy, humility, serving something bigger became the same even as the Ottoman Empire grew and Orthodox political power declined. These values were confirmed by the Eastern Orthodox Church, which was still central to people's lives. The Church also served as a steadying influence, providing spiritual and local practical leadership in the midst of foreign occupation. To divert back this ranting, there is a need to point out how Byzantine chivalry has an impact on the martial and social developments of later Orthodox Christian societies in the context of their relations to the West and the new historical epics and powers. Although the Byzantine Empire as a political entity had come to an end, its legacy of chivalric values was still a strong influence in the cultural and military arenas of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and even the Mediterranean. It was a turning point in Eastern Mediterranean and European history as the Ottoman Empire replaced the Byzantine Empire. Nevertheless, with the Ottoman conquest, the Byzantine cultural and military tradition was extinguished in the Orthodox countries. These customs were steeped in the military as well as the social consciousness of all of the Eastern European successor states, such as Russia, Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria. In Russia, the concept of the Third Rome served as an important focus for the preservation of the Byzantine heritage. After the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire in 1453, the Russian rulers considered themselves the new Rome and the rightful successor to Byzantium. Ivan III turned Kolachev's council into a public forum, drawing all Muscovites into the patriotic task of creating a new state destined to fulfill Byzantine territories that had been left unguarded since the fall of Constantinople and its Byzantine Empire in the spring of 1453, 1-13. Ivan III was agitated by the Turks, who had great influence in the Black Sea area, and he even entertained ideas of moving into the territory, which was a predominantly Byzantine region that stretched from the Crimea to the mouth of the Danube, where the Black Sea served as the last great Byzantine lake under Venetian influence. Levante Tsar Ivan III once ordered his Great Seal destroyed in an operation that concerned him greatly. Versus in Narodiami Tsarev Rossis, she was to tell her story in all its facets by putting many practical questions. These nuptials represented the Russian quest for the heritage of Byzantium. The Russian Empire emulated several Byzantine practices, such as the double-headed eagle, symbol of the Byzantine emperor, and used the Latin-derived name of Caesar for its ruler, Tsar in Russian. The impact of Byzantine tradition on Russian military ethos was tremendous. These followed the example of their Byzantine predecessors, regarding themselves as the champion of Orthodox Christianity. The Russian military aristocracy was, like the Akritai, a chivalric warrior aristocracy, for which loyalty, honor, and service to the state and the faith were paramount. Russian military leaders were supposed to embody these virtues, which were so closely associated with their status as defenders of the empire and the Christian faith. And Serbia also continued to retain the Byzantine idea of the knightly warrior after the loss of Constantinople. The Serbian nobility that came under the influence of Byzantine culture long before preserved some of the chivalric values of the Byzantine warrior aristocracy. The concept of protecting Orthodox Christianity from outsider threats continued to be an integral part of the Serbian political military identity. A battle at Kosovo Polje in 1389, contested by Stefan Hrebeljanović, was a symbol for the Serb people's devotion to these principles. Prince Lazar's death in battle, defending both his faith and kingdom, was transformed into that of a martyr and hero inspired by the Byzantine ideal of the devoted Christian warrior giving up his life for his people and the greater good. The Kingdom of Bulgaria, under Byzantine cultural influence in the early periods, also maintained vestiges of Byzantine chivalric culture in the form of the Stareyest Voto and old boyar families' military organization and social aspirations. The Bulgarians, much like the Serbs, viewed themselves as protectors of Christendom, defending the Orthodox Christian faith against the advancing Ottoman Empire. Despite the extinction of the Byzantine Empire as a polity, the memory of the impact of Byzantine military power and chivalric norms that were part of Byzantine culture remained embedded in the military practices of the Balkans. The idea of a professional savior military class whose sole purpose was to protect the faith and the faithful still made sense to the people there. One of the most enduring legacies of the Byzantine ethos of chivalry in the East was a codification of religious faith. For the Byzantine state was not only defended with its armies, it was defended as a Christian state. In Eastern European Orthodox states, the same principle remained part of the military ethos. Military men were supposed to be not merely brave, but pious Christians, ready to fight for the faith against all outside enemies. The concept of the Christian warrior was central to this philosophy, which was seen in that military campaigns were justified as religious crusades. This conjunction of military service and religious belief was seen most fully in the Russian Empire. The Russian Tsar was protector of orthodoxy, and the spiritual and military leader of the Russian Empire was so deeply intertwined that even the Tsar's military authority was derived from his function as the leader of Russia's national church. The Russian warrior aristocracy, akin to the Byzantine akriti, were to fight not for loot, but for the defense of the faith. This image of the Christian warrior fighting for the divine objective of justice and innocence was not so much a foreign import as a direct extension of Byzantine military values. The cultural habits and social organization of the Byzantine Empire also left their mark on the nobility of Eastern Europe. The Byzantine aristocracy was very much engaged in both the military and civil sectors, and it was imperative for them to hold their honor, their loyalty, and their Christian faith close to their chest. This patrician ideal of behavior persisted as a standard expectation for both the Russian and Serbian aristocracy, who were, again like those in Byzantium, supposed to be worthy servants both of their rulers and of their faith. Apart from these military and social aspects, Byzantine chivalric ideology significantly influenced the art and the literary culture of the post-Byzantine world. Heroic chronicles that extolled the bravery of Byzantine soldiers, especially men who had defended the empire against foreign enemies, were part of oral traditions as well as the written texts of the Orthodox world for many generations. These tales would typically portray warriors as paragons of chivalric virtues, focusing in particular on their loyalty to their emperor, their courage in combat, and their piety towards the Christian God. In Russia, for example, the Bylinas stressed the warlike and Christianity-serving aspect of some of its heroes, It was in these epic stories that characters such as knights and generals and emperors were portrayed and idealized as reflecting the values of courage, honor, and loyalty. While not Byzantine in the purest sense, these heroes were testament to Byzantine chivalry ideals on Russian culture. The focus on the defense of faith and people, as well as of righteous warriors who battle for higher motives, is a continuation of Byzantine ideas. In Greece, the legacy of Byzantine chivalry persisted in the national consciousness, particularly during the time of the Ottoman domination. The concept of the noble warrior who took up arms in defense of religious and national liberty soon became a popular theme in Greek revolutionary literature and popular folklore. The Greek War of Independence of 1821 was cast not only as a national fight for independence, but as the sacred mission to liberate the Orthodox Christian people from centuries of Ottoman rule. The brave men fighting in this war were portrayed as a latter-day army of Byzantine warriors, military prowess with fervid religious fervor. Mooney writes that the values of chivalry such as bravery, honor, and loyalty, which were embodied by European nobility, were integrated into the modern Greek struggle for independence, and that the revolutionary leaders, e.g., Theodoros Kolokotronis, Alexandros Ypsilantis, saw themselves as the spiritual heirs of the Byzantine defenders of the faith. This link between Byzantine chivalry and the Greek War of Independence clearly reveals the influence of the Byzantine cultural heritage upon the development of national identities and martial traditions in Eastern Europe. One crucial aspect left to peel away as we scrabble for an insight into the ongoing relevance of the Byzantine code of chivalry is the wider impact which this had on the cultural and intellectual life of the Eastern European and Orthodox Christian societies for centuries following the collapse of the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The influence of Byzantine chivalry was not restricted to the military and to the aristocracy. It was equally decisive for the formation of the intellectual and social elites which came out of the ruins of the empire. One of the most enduring legacies of Byzantine chivalric values was the presiding over of Byzantine intellectual and religious traditions. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had been a disaster for an age, but Byzantine scholars, clergy, and the like remained to play a role in the intellectual world of Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Balkans. These scholars were also the bearers of extensive knowledge from the time of the Byzantine Empire, such as theology, philosophy, and history, much of which did directly relate to the ideal of honor, loyalty, and piety that was the Byzantines' interpretation of knightly conduct. Byzantine ideas on the moral obligations of rulers and the role of leadership in both military and civil matters still echoed throughout the Orthodox Christian world. Byzantine philosophers and theologians had long debated the role of the emperor as a political and religious figure, and those ideas were picked up and developed later by thinkers in the Orthodox world. Among the Russians, this notion was accepted with enthusiasm, for they believed that their Tsar was the Chivalry, that a Byzantine emperor should not only be their legislator but also their ruler in spiritual matters. They were prepared to admit. The influence of chivalric ethos was also evident in the post-Byzantine education. Following the fall of Constantinople, Eastern Orthodoxy became increasingly identified with the Greek national identity of the Byzantine Empire. Monasteries and church schools were the major source of learning, and Byzantine scholars and theologians wrote primarily for this audience. Christian virtues, the crucial need for loyalty to the ruler, and moral obligations of both warriors and citizens were suggested elements of the curriculum. And so the Byzantine model of integrating military service with religious devotion would meet the educational needs of future generations. The Church was responsible for saving the Byzantine chivalric values from oblivion. The Church in the Byzantine Empire had been integrated into both the political and military structures. The protectors of the Orthodox Christian faith were the Byzantine emperors, and the Church gave moral direction to both the rulers and the soldiers. Despite the conquest of Constantinople, the Orthodox Church remained as the spiritual center for the Eastern European societies and the promoter of the basic principles and values found in the Byzantine chivalric ethos, such as honor, faith, piety, and loyalty. In Russia, the Church played a key role in the formation of the idea of a Christian soldier. Russian culture was shaped by the belief that military service was a sacred obligation and that soldiers should battle not for personal honor, but for the protection of faith. Vladimir Bushinsky writes that the Russian Church taught the Russian military elite that they should be considered warriors not only because they were successful in armed struggle, but also because they were soldiers of Christ, and they had a special spiritual duty to fulfill before God and the country. This military service, religious service tie had its origins in the Byzantine conception of the emperor as a warrior protector of the Church. When we consider the wider cultural influence of the chivalric ethos, we cannot neglect the role that Byzantine art and literature played in the preservation and transmission of these values. The Byzantine Empire is famous for its grand architecture and its religious and military themes. The icons, frescoes, and mosaics created during the existence of the Byzantine Empire represented scenes of military victories, religious themes, and the moral virtues associated with chivalry. They are not simple ornaments, but pedagogical instruments, which transmitted the values of the empire to the citizens. Following the conquest of Constantinople, its traditions of pronouncement on the one hand and of exalted poetry, previously spurned by the urbane genteel man of letters, turned up day by day in fresher shapes, and the schools of Russia and Greece tirelessly devoted days and nights to the manufacture of ever-new Byzantino-inspired articles of the church and religious art artist, somically influencing the imaginary world and the spiritual, as well as the mundane life values entrusted to the guardianship of their parishioners. The literature of the Byzantine Empire also helped keep the spirit of chivalry alive. Great heroic epics which extolled courage and sacrifice among the Byzantine soldiers and warriors became part of the folklore of later generations of Eastern Slavs and Russians. The tales were transmitted through oral tradition and written manuscripts, with the telling bearing a moral message or an ethical lesson of loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice. The ideas of Christian chivalry and the notion of the soldier as a defender of the faith were common in the literature of the post-Byzantine world. In Greece, for instance, the 19th century struggle for independence from Ottoman rule was cast in the language of a holy war to protect Orthodox Christianity. The new Greek revolutionaries invoked the memory of Byzantine heroes and martyrs in their struggle, and regarded themselves as the modern defenders of the faith, just as Byzantine warriors had fought to defend the empire. This linkage of the Byzantine military tradition to the Greek War of Independence illustrates how the honorary value of medieval chivalry continued to guide the self-perception of the people down into the modern era after the fall of the empire. Literature and art. In the area of military institutions and codes of chivalric conduct, Byzantine ideals influenced the evolution of chivalry in Eastern Europe and Russia. The importance of a code of honor, loyalty, or obedience and discipline was an institutional development that shaped the military orders, and the sight of these calls was central to the formation of military orders and knighthood in general. In Russia, for example, the Cossacks, a 15th century warrior class, adopted many of the values of Byzantine chivalry. The Cossacks had a reputation for being fiercely loyal to the Russian Tsar, for their devotion to protecting Orthodoxy Christianity, and for valuing military discipline and personal honor. The parallel between mighty Byzantine chivalry and Cossack military ethics testifies to the lasting influence in Eastern Europe of Byzantine heritage upon military organization. The Cossacks were, in the minds of contemporaries, akin to the Byzantine akriti, defenders of the faith and of the Christian people. As warriors, their valor was often combined with demonstrations of piety, for their conduct was as much indebted to its sense of a moral obligation to the state and church as to the maintenance of their divine calling. The continuity of Byzantine code of chivalry can be observed in the strong role of honor, loyalty, and religious faith in the military and social culture of Eastern Europe and Orthodox world in the centuries following the fall of the Byzantine Empire. Whether it's through art, literature, education, or even in how armies were taught to fight, the values of the Byzantine warriors carried on and continued to shape the next generations of people who came after them. Not that they simply were inherited values, they were still living traditions to set the stamp upon the lives of posterity and to inoculate coming generations with the spirit of courage and honor and religious devotion.